Meta perks in Dead by Daylight are notorious for their aggressive design, which encourages people to force them instead of waiting till they proc organically. Quite often such behavior gives these perks away even before they actually come into play. A survivor is running right into you after getting unhooked, most likely dead hard or off the record. The killer picked your teammate up but is taking forever to get them to the hook. Get ready for pain res. However, not all meta perks are like this. Throughout the game's history, there have been several of them with a much more subtle effect. And the first of them was Iron Will. Belonging to Jake Park, one of the 3 original survivors, Iron Will has been around since the beta version of the game. At that time, it used to completely remove the groans of injured survivors. And before you say anything, yes, I'm aware that after the recent buff, this is exactly how it works in the live version. Or does it? Because if you look past just tier 3 of this perk, you're gonna find some pretty interesting differences. Today, we're used to the fact that perk tiers barely stand out from each other. For example, in the case of Iron Will, we got 80% volume reduction on tier 1, 90% on tier 2, and 100% on tier 3, and that's it. The old Iron Will not only had a much more extreme and frankly weird percentage distribution of 50, 100, and 100, but also took effect only if you were standing still on tier 1 and 2. And this is what made these tiers practically unusable, because the only use case I can think of that doesn't imply moving is probably crouching behind the corner to misdirect the killer. But again, that's tier 2, with its 100% volume reduction. Tier 1 couldn't even do that, because I just cannot fathom how someone would lose a crouching survivor whose grunts of pain are only 50% quieter. Stand here, behind the thing. Actually, I could have stood there. Are you standing? Yo. Alright, maybe it isn't that bad, okay, like... But that's not 50%, man. I feel like it's 80-ish something. It's like, I think it's even quieter than the 75% Iron Will. And this is where you're supposed to ask, why even bother comparing the perk tiers if people leveled them up to tier 3 in just a blink of an eye anyway? But did they though? The thing is, leveling up perks in older versions of DBD took much longer than today. First of all, because as a survivor in the best case scenario, you could earn about 14,000 blood points per match. And with how dense the Bloodweb used to be at that time, it meant that leveling one perk used to take like 10 times longer. And that's not even to mention that the game didn't give you a choice which perk to buy, because even on level 50 it still offered you only one perk. So if you really wanted to use Iron Will, you were unfortunately stuck with tier 1 and tier 2 for quite a long time. But you don't have to take my word for it. Just go watch some 2016 videos by popular YouTubers and notice how most of them didn't bother to change their perks for weeks if not months, even with the release of new DLCs. Because that's how long it used to take them to unlock new perks on their main characters. By the spring of 2017, when I finally started playing DBD myself, Iron Will was already mildly popular. Not as popular as, let's say, Self-Care or Decisive Strike, but still was pretty common in public games. Over time, its popularity continued to grow, until in the fall/winter of 2017 it became pretty much synonymous with the word meta. Why? Well, because by that time the Survivor gameplay significantly evolved and it was no longer just about hiding and running. Now it also included a whole bunch of different tricks, or as people like to call them, techs, which were used to flex on the killer. Like for example the FOV tag, heal tag, locker tag, window tag, CJ tag, the aforementioned crouch behind the corner tag, item tag, holding W tag, simply existing on the map tag, rage quitting in the slightest inconvenience tag, bum look no hands tag, scratching the balls tag. Anyway, a lot of them were based on the premise that the killer didn't know where you were and what you were doing. A good example would be the variation of the dumb tag where you blind the killer after a pallet stun and then slowly slide over to their side, making it impossible for them to break the pallet for several seconds. Or that body block gimmick the devs fixed several years ago. You know, the one where you needed to wait until someone else stunned the killer with a pallet and then sneak up on them from behind so that they could neither move nor break the pallet until they hit you. By the nature of these techs, you could only use them when being at full health, because in the injured state the killer would hear you through your grunts of pain and you would get dunked on faster than you could say easy. And that's when Iron Will really came in handy. In fact, this perk added an extra level of insidiousness to these techs, because quite often killers simply didn't expect them from injured survivors, who generally tend to take much less risk compared to healthy survivors. Another reason why Iron Will started getting more recognition was that it helped survivors perform better at looping, because it allowed them to detach from loops while being injured as if they were fully healed. When you're healed, the way you do it is you find a loop where your movement is obscured by walls and other random obstacles, and you stay there for some time in order to make the killer think that you have no intention of leaving. And when this finally happens, you need to pick the right moment when the killer has no line of sight to you and start running to the next nearest tile. If implemented right, the killer is gonna continue chasing ghosts for some time, which will allow you to gain extra distance for some fat juicy shift and W action. Doing this while injured was much riskier, because once the killer heard that the injured noises started fading away, they instantly knew that you were trying to break the chase and followed you. Iron Will completely solved this problem and put the killer back in the guessing position. With the introduction of Spirit in patch 2.2.0, using Iron Will became not just preferable, but literally mandatory. The thing is, within her power, in order to track survivors, she has to rely solely on scratch marks and sound. And if the former can be manipulated with and used to throw her off, the latter serves as a pretty accurate indication of where the survivor is. This meant that after taking the first hit against her, taking the second was just a matter of time. A matter of 3 seconds to be exact, because now that she could hear your groans, this is exactly how long she needed to catch up with you and down you. Seeing this, even those players who up until then were still skeptical about Iron Will also started running it. However, it didn't help them. Well, at least not for long, because pretty quickly Spirit mains learned that they could partially counter Iron Will with Stridor. For the past several years, this perk has been under the radar, to the point that people who started playing DBD recently might not even know what it does. Allow me to remind you. Basically, Stridor is the opposite of Iron Will. It increases the volume of survivors' injured noises by 50% and the volume of their breathing by 25%. Originally, this perk had an additive effect, meaning that in order to calculate how loud it would make survivors, you needed to take the volume of their sounds before Stridor and add to the percentage increase from Stridor. For example, by default, the volume of all survivor sounds is set to 100%. This means that Stridor would increase it to 125% for healthy survivors and 150% for injured ones. In the case of Iron Will, since the grunts of pain were reduced all the way to 0%, Stridor increased them back to 50%. Yes, it wasn't ideal, because it was half as loud as it would be if the survivor didn't have Iron Will, but it was still enough for spirits to be able to counter any of your mind games in the injured state. Depending on the version of the game, the effectiveness of Stridor against Iron Will used to vary. For example, in version 2.3.3, it made the survivor sounds barely discernible, so you couldn't really rely on them.
Yeah, the chase music kind of ruins it. I mean, I'll probably be able to hear you in the during the phase walk. Yeah, no, honestly, your footsteps are like louder than your groans. So brother, I don't know, maybe I'm just bad at Spirit.
On the contrary, in version 4.4.2, it made survivors so loud that it literally sounded as if they didn't have Iron Will at all.
Okay, let's check it out now. Oh, wow. Man, it does work. It does work. It's so much better in this version.
But this shouldn't surprise you, because overall DBD sound is known for its inconsistency. I know it's besides the point, but just to illustrate what I'm talking about, back in the day every other update used to mess with the max volume of the game. And I'm not talking about your personal audio settings. What I'm talking about is the fact that if you download 5 different DBD versions of the past, set the volume to 100% and compare the sound, it's gonna be different for every version. Soon this made Stridor a staple of the Spirit gameplay. At some point it became such a popular choice for this character that whenever you loaded into the match and heard your character breathing louder than usual, you instantly knew that it was gonna be Spirit. The war between Iron Will fans and Stridor enjoyers lasted for about 3 years, with neither of the sides willing to give up and switch to a different perk. The devs didn't intervene in it much, preferring to enjoy the show from the sidelines. They clearly didn't think there was anything wrong with this situation, because the only thing they did that affected it even in the slightest was bridge the gap between the 3 tiers of Iron Will. For this, they removed the standing still condition from tiers 1 and 2, while also decreasing the tier 2 audio level reduction from 100% to 75%. The funny thing is that even this humble change wasn't motivated by the devs' desire to end the war between Iron Will and Stridor. It's just by that time the devs realized that the original approach to balancing perk tiers became obsolete, and they started gradually revisiting their old perks and fine-tuned to meet their new standards. And Iron Will was just one of the most obvious candidates. In July of 2021, the balancing department finally ran out of popcorn and decided to step in. Basically, they sided with survivors and changed Stridor to apply its effect as a multiplier. This made it take effect only when interacting with sounds that were louder than 0 decibels, because otherwise the game would multiply its value by 0 and the resulting volume would also be 0. And since at that time Iron Will still decreased the noises of injured survivors by 100%, that's exactly how Stridor behaved against it. In other words, when these two perks came into play at the same time, the game prioritized Iron Will, limiting Stridor to increasing only the volume of survivors breathing in the healthy state. Survivors, myself included, were over the moon with this update. I mean, of course we were. After all, one of our favorite perks officially became uncounterable. However, our triumph was short-lived, because in just a year, Behavior started their infamous crusade against the OG meta perks, which of course included Iron Will. And let me tell you something, the devs really did this perk dirty. First thing they changed was how much Iron Will suppressed the groans. The values went down from 50, 75, and 100% to 25, 50, and 75. This meant that from now on, even on tier 3, this perk no longer made you completely silent, thus allowing the killer to track you. On top of it, now Iron Will became completely inactive when you suffered from exhaustion, which meant that using it with perks like Sprint Burst, Life, Balance Landing, and so on became non-viable. As expected, this nerf caused an outrage among survivors. But it was a completely different outrage than, let's say, with Dead Hard, which was also nerfed in this patch. Because at least with Dead Hard, as much as people were against the rework, deep inside they still understood that it was the right thing to do. With Iron Will, not so much. Yes, it was a strong perk, maybe a little overused, but it wasn't even remotely overpowered. So people weren't upset with how much it was nerfed, but rather with the fact that Behavior touched this perk in the first place. Despite the fact that the nerf of Iron Will affected all survivors, some of them had it worse than others. Because now that the grunts of pain couldn't be suppressed, people started noticing that for some reason some characters sounded louder than others, which made them easier to track. The reason for this was that when recording the voiceover for different survivors, Behavior didn't bother to level the volume of their tracks, thus making some of them depend on Iron Will more than others. If you mean Dwight or Claudette or any other survivor with an acceptable noise volume, you won't be able to relate to that. In fact, this might sound absolutely ludicrous to you. Like, come on, how bad can it be? Well, it can be really bad. Just talk to any Ash or Leon main and they will confirm to you that for them there's absolutely no such thing as stealth in the injured state.
Wait. Okay, in case you ever wondered what Ash sounds against Stridor, there you go. That's the distance that he's audible at.
The problem of different volume levels didn't appear because of the Iron Will nerf. People actually noticed it even before that. But now that Iron Will was out of the equation, it became even more apparent. What's crazy about this situation is that even after 2 years of people constantly complaining about it, Behavior is still refusing to acknowledge this issue and normalize the volume of survivors' groans.
I mean, it's not like it's that hard to do or anything. You just take the WAV files, import them into Audacity or whatever you're using, and lower down the volume sliders. That's it. Seriously, I can do it for you.
Well, let's get back to the topic. I'm not gonna lie, after this update, I succumbed to the herd mentality and completely forgot about Iron Will. But when about a month ago the devs announced that they would be buffing it again, curiosity got the better of me, and before this version of the perk was gone, I decided to give it a try and see how bad things actually were. On the last day of the Twisted Masquerade event, I spent like 12 hours running it, and what can I say? First of all, the 75% reduction wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Yes, it was audible, but I felt like it was mostly audible on my end, because I can't even count how many times during that gaming session I found myself in a situation where the killer couldn't hear me with me standing literally 3 meters away from them.
Oh wow. You didn't hear me? Hail to Iron Will?
I guess on their end it sounded like I was further away, so they kept walking forward until the grunts started fading away, which made them think that they went the wrong way. As for the exhaustion part, it was a little more annoying. You might think that the problem was that you couldn't use Iron Will with exhaustion perks at all, but that's not quite true. This you could actually play around by making sure that the exhaustion perk didn't come into play too early into the chase, so that you had more time with Iron Will. Oh, and of course the exhaustion perk couldn't be Sprint Burst, because then Iron Will would be inactive 90% of the time. The actual problem was that you had to reteach yourself to not use exhaustion perks whenever you wanted, but rather keep them as the absolute last resort. It might not sound that hard when you say it, but trust me, if you're a lithe or a balance landing user like myself, you'd constantly find yourself instinctively triggering exhaustion while still being healthy. And then when the killer hit you, you'd wonder why Iron Will didn't activate as you expected. I swear, in moments like this I started considering going back to Dead Hard, because at least with this perk you never have to worry about accidentally using it preemptively preemptively. As I'm recording this video, the aforementioned buff of Iron Will has already hit the live servers. Just like we saw on the PTB, it increased the audio level reductions to 80, 90, and 100%, which essentially reverted the nerf implemented in patch 6.1.0. Well, minus the exhaustion part, of course. And that's great, because finally people will get a reason to run it again, which will diversify the current pool of meta perks. I got a faint feeling that it might have worked better if behavior kept the volume reduction at 75%, but instead completely removed the exhaustion restriction. But again, I totally understand why they didn't do it, because like I've already mentioned, quite often Iron Will is used not for hiding, but rather for gaining more distance in the chase, which essentially makes it act like an exhaustion perk. So it only makes sense that the devs don't want to bring back the synergy between Iron Will and the actual exhaustion perks. So far, Iron Will is the third perk from the old meta that behavior have revisited and reverted its nerf, which makes you wonder, are they also missing the old meta? If so, I'm dying to know which perk they're gonna revert next. Hope that's gonna be Spine Chill, cause I wouldn't mind my Speedvolt build back.